Hello guys, it's Verts here and welcome to 3D Mutiny. In this video, I'm going to show you unique and powerful ways you can move limbs inside of ZBrush. From the very simple quick adjustments of a limb while you're sculpting, all the way to the more advanced multi-subobject ZSphere rigs, very useful for posing a character. I'll also cover the common mistakes I see students make as a university lecturer and tips I've picked up along the way inside of the games industry. The first method to move the limb is by use of masking, and more specifically using things like the lasso. So take this character, for example, in an A pose. Let's say we want to put the legs together so they're lying flush against each other, and also lift the arms up so they're T pose. So that could be quite difficult because there's a lot of mechanical anatomy that's changing. So for example, when the arms go up, scapula's moving, the shoulders are moving. Now the perfect solution for that would be actually to fully rig the character and get someone to weight paint it with the skin. We don't have enough time for that in ZBrush. So there's a couple of techniques that we can use to make that a little bit easier. So something to note with this character that it's comprised of multiple subdivisions. By subdivisions, I mean this is a quadded mesh that can be scrolled up and down. So it's got the lowest quality one, which is quite easy to manipulate. And then we've got a higher quality version, which is actually quite hard to manipulate. So this method is going to work with both. But if you've got a subdivided model, it's going to make it a little bit easier when it comes to blending a mask. And that'll be more apparent soon. So the way I like to do it is if you hold Control and then come up to the brush and just change this to a mask lasso, it means you're going to be able to draw a circle around the joint. And it's really important when it comes to in between the arm, for example, you want to be quite accurate with that. So with the lasso tool, I just select the arm entirely. With that mask selection, really important just to make sure you haven't accidentally selected other parts of the mesh, because that's going to cause issues later. With that mask, what we can do is hold Control and then click off to the canvas. That's basically going to invert it. So all the movements we're going to do is going to affect only this limb. Now what I could do is come to the move gizmo up here, and then holding Alt, I can adjust the position of this. I basically want to put it somewhere where the joint is located, so where the bone meets the scapula. And now what you can see while holding nothing, I can just move this across and you'll see a couple of errors that are coming up. So we'll show you how to fix those. So it might be the case that you're okay with that and you can just clean it up later. But ideally, if we do a nice mask first, then it's going to save us time. So the first way to fix this is come back to draw mode. And if you hold Control and click on the white area, it's basically going to smooth out this mask and soften it. And as a result, it's going to be a less harsh transition when you start to move the clay. So that only works if you've got quite a low resolution geometry. So say, for example, if we had this on 6 divisions and then we try to use the same method, it's doing a smooth, but it's only transitioning very slightly. And the opposite's true with a low resolution mesh. So if you press Control here on the white area, it's going to do quite a broad transition. So once that mask is selected, you can actually scroll up the divisions back to somewhere during the mid. And what you see here now, the transition is a lot smoother, but the only issue is at the back here, because we haven't masked this area, it's starting to drag up parts of the back. So it might be that the anatomy is accidental and it looks good, but I suggest basically aggressively masking areas of that so it doesn't drag up the arm. So to fix areas like that more accurately, usually what I like to do is you come to the basic material or just the materials, then you find something called flat color, and then with flat color you can really see the definition of your mask and where it's being applied to. So what you might want to do is find the perfect angle for the armpit, for example, here, and then I can just make a more accurate lasso addition by just holding Control and drawing that circle. Now if you come back to basic material, move that, you can see how it's not collecting the underside of the lap, but we still have this harsh transition. So with that, all you do is hold Control, click the white area, and then that's going to soften the mask, and then it's going to act more like skin when you start to move that limb. Also, what's going to be important is play around with the location of the pivot. So that can sometimes matter. So hold Alt, and ideally you're looking for something that has anatomical accuracy. The thing with the shoulder is at a certain point when the shoulder moves, the triceps start to get engaged and also the scapulas start to bring up the arm. So there is actual local movement, not just rotation. So what you're going to basically want to do is adjust this with both the rotation and the move gizmo and just make something that looks accurate to your eye. So don't worry that pivot point's not perfectly in the right position. As long as you're moving it, you're getting the desired effect, and that's okay. So the benefit of using a mid-tier subdivision is when you press D and then come up to your higher details, it means you're going to have fewer artifacts left on there. If this was your high definition mesh and your only option, what you'd have to do is basically come in here and smooth out any artifacts. That's basically unavoidable. I wouldn't stress it so much in getting the perfect mask, because you can always come over and just repair those artifacts. It's just as fast. Similar technique with the leg, but obviously we have a bit more of a complicated joint. We have a hip joint, which also includes the glutes, and these are really close together, so sometimes they can interfere with each other. So for this, what I do is I just select the entire leg up to about here. Once that's done, I zoom in a little bit further just so I can be more accurate with the mask selection. Basically what I'm aiming for is to split the pelvis from the leg. I just aim for the hip bone just up there. So I'm doing that from the front. But then if we look from the back, obviously it's made this diagonal split. And if you imagine the legs moving, it's obviously stretching the glutes. So there's going to be lots of adjustments here in smoothing. For this area, what I suggest doing is you come off lasso and change that back to a pen mask. And then we're going to do what we did with the blurring of the mask near the arm, but this time we're going to do it manually. We're almost going to paint a feathered effect across the glute. Get quite a big brush for this, and I'm just going to lightly hold control this incision line. Now when it comes to your one, you're going to be making these adjustments and then testing it with your movement, so it's going to be much of a back and forth process. So the main concept here is that the hip is going to be the landmark that's not moving. It's almost like the anchor, and then everything else is going to move across it. There might be a bit of skin folding. You just have to work that out yourself. But if we're just doing a simple straight-legged exercise, then it should be easy enough. I suggest leaving this area slightly unmasked. That's almost part of the anchor. Obviously you don't want those all separating. This is going to stay and remain the same. It's almost like the midpoint. So invert the mask, hold Alt and aim slightly where the hip hinge is. Click and drag down towards the foot. And from here, you're just going to test the effect that your mask had. So if we do it side to side, that's reasonably well. Maybe there's a bit too much soft deformation here. We can change that. And also from side to side, it's vaguely there, but maybe a smoother transition of the mask is going to let that glute come out nicely. So an example of how you make those adjustments, I just come to the pen tool and I'm going to add more mask around here. So that's not got so much movement. It's a bit more of a sharper mask. And I also might consider moving the pivot point and playing around with that and see what effect it has. So that's a bit more realistic. If I want less pinching around the hip, all I have to do is move the hold Alt and move this pivot point to the side. And now you can see we've got less of an effect there. Around this area obviously isn't anatomically perfect, but to be honest, I wouldn't even bother repairing that area. I'll just come in after and sort of like re-sculpt it. That's actually quite a good version of it. Most difficult areas around the glute. So for example, to fix this, all we have to do is just make sure that there's not too much of a mask happening on the inside. So get the mask pen, Control and Alt, and then just rub. So it's going to move with the gizmo. And now you can see, now comes the fun part of sort of squishing this around. It's unlikely that with such an advanced pose, like you're doing something like that, you would have to re-sculpt it and reform it, or you would take the latter option that we're going to go through, which is almost rig it. So it does have a nice transition. There also might be a scenario where you've posed the character. Maybe you were going off a guideline or scan data. So this is very common with scan data. Or for example, if you were following the base mesh form anatomy, we follow a very strict guideline for perfect proportions, but it basically means that the character's stood upright. So this process is really easy for getting that character back into an open position. In the second video, we do that beforehand, so we don't have the Dynamesh all sticking together. But if by chance you accidentally did do that, I'm going to show you here how you can basically repair that and then start to move the limbs. So there's quite a few ways you could actually do this. Say for example, we could cut the character in half, especially for the legs, and then re-weld it together via Symmetry. The only thing with that is it won't work for the under armpits, because the under armpits aren't in the center of the world. So a method that I prefer to do is we're going to make use of booleans. And if you're not familiar with booleans, we're going to go through it very quickly, but I'll just give an example of the issues that we have here. So obviously there's not enough geometry data for us to use. There's no under armpit that we can mask accurately. We're always going to be left with this ugly feature here. So if you're okay and confident with repairing something like that, then you can go ahead and just sort of like tuck it in maybe with the move brush and then re-Dynamesh it or Z-remesh it. What I prefer to do is maintain as much as the original mesh as possible. So we're going to make an incision here, like an empty space that is going to allow us to mask it. So if you come to, we're going to append a basic cube. We're going to use the gizmo to basically make a very thin plate and position this in between the torso and the arm. So you could make use out of transparency mode over here. It's going to be the same on your default layouts. Now with this shape, basically what we're aiming for is almost like the person's holding a book in between their arm. And that's going to give us a nice space to do an adjustment. So remember with this, it's a piece of clay, so we can just use normal move brushes. So you can actually get quite accurate accurate to the original anatomy. Maybe you even want to put in a bit of a pit and make that curvature there. After that, with the gizmo, I just come and I hold the red indicator and then just make it very, very thin, so we keep as much of the original mesh as possible. So you can do that on both sides, or we can do one side and mirror it over after. So with live boolean up here, and it's going to be the same of yours, you're going to be looking for live boolean. That's a toggle, that's a mode. So we're going to go and press on. We're now in live boolean mode, and then with the subtractive geometry that we've made, we want to come over here and just adjust and change it from addition to subtraction. It's just to the right, and what you can see here, it's made this slot or this armpit. That's going to allow us to mask it. So it's exactly the same process with the inside of the leg. In fact, what I'll do is I'll show you a second technique, a cool technique for getting rid of that, which is quite easy and just as fast. But once you're happy with that incision, we're going to come down to boolean and make boolean mesh. So once you make boolean mesh, it's actually going to create another subtool. So if you see, we've got the two units here, is our original and the subtraction, and then with our make mesh, it's created another mesh. So click on that mesh, and then with the same technique, we can just lasso, zoom into this area. Again, I change it to flat color just so it's easy to select, and then we can aim straight down the middle. And this is a bit of a game, so you don't hit the sides. Bring it up to about the apex of the shoulder, and then just make sure the mask is complete. For the sake of time, I won't blend this nicely, but you can see the effect it's having. We're now not getting that stretched piece of geometry that we have to deal with. All we have to do is come in here and just change the transition, maybe just smooth this out, or introduce the lat muscles and the under armpits. Also gives us quite a cool basis for adding things like the pectoral and how it comes into the arm. So you're always going to be adjusting the anatomy after you've repositioned the character. An alternative you can do is a bit faster, but it's also a bit more dangerous, I'd say, is if you come to mask and then change this to a rectangle. With the rectangle, you're going to just create the smallest mask or plate that you can physically make. It's going to cut off parts of the thigh, but again, we're just going to come in and repair that later. If you then come down to split and then split mask points, it split our original into two sections, so the trash that we're going to delete, and now we've got this gap. So that gives you options to basically close the gap. Very useful when it comes to fingers, for example. We can just cut out a hole and then maybe re-Dynamesh it or reconstruct it. To be honest, with re-Dynamesh, it sometimes sticks together, so what I'd use is an insert multi-mesh, and then with the insert multi-mesh, we can get something like a cube or a cylinder. Probably a cube's going to be the best. And what you can do is just draw a cube out, and then with the gizmo, position this, and you're almost making this part of the mesh which can be used to fill in the hole. So spend as much time as you want aligning this up so it doesn't interact with the rest of the mesh. But what you're mainly looking for is to fill that chasm, and then when you come to Dynamesh, it's not going to go across, it's going to go straight down the leg. So there might also be scenarios where you quickly want to pose something, but you've got all the clothes on top and you don't want to go down the rigging method. So there is a way of doing it. So say, for example, with the arm, what we're going to do is use the same technique. You want to get it to a level where you're happy with, so it's moving nicely and it's not putting in too many errors. I'm not going to fix that for the sake of time. So with that character in solo mode, just going to come out of solo and keep it in that position. We're then going to do the exact same for the coat and the jacket. So you're going to make a similar selection and then blur it, hold control and just tap this a couple of times. Invert the mask, and then if you come back to the gizmo, we roughly want it in the same place as the joint. Maybe this could use a bit of softening at the top, so I'll use the brush for that. So back in draw mode, I'm going to hold control and alt and just feather this away so it's a smoother transition, just like a coat would interact. So ignore these bits. This is just how I originally made the character, because it wasn't the intention to move it like this. We're going to use this for a pose, but it gets across the example of how you can move clothing. So what we've got here is we've got the original character and it's got the selected mask that we were testing out. We've also got the jacket, which has also saved the mask that we've done. Now what we're going to do is if we come to gizmo, we're going to select the joint, and then just here we can change it into moving multiple sub-objects. I call it the pizza boxes. So if you just click it once, you'll see this checker turns up. So anything that has this checkered effect isn't going to be moved, or it's not going to be manipulated. So right now you can see that the body is checkered. We do want it selected. So what I'm going to do is hold control and shift, and then I'm going to tap on it once, and then that means it's going to include the body in the deformation that we're going to do, or the movement that we're going to do. Now when we come to move this, you'll see that the arms and the jacket are moving together. So under the hood, you can't see it now because it's not selected, but the character is masked. ZBrush understands that the main body's masked and the arms aren't. And the one we have selected, we can see what's going on. We can see that the jacket's masked and not the arms. So make all the moves and adjustments that you want. Maybe you've got an accessory on the arm that you want to include. That's very simple. You just hold control and shift, click that once, and then that's also going to be included in the movement. So this process is good for very quick edits. Maybe you're mid sculpting, you just want to make adjustments. But if you're posing the character, I wouldn't suggest it, because every time you want to make a movement, say we change the joint to an elbow, we're going to have to make all these technical masks and basically select each thing individually. It's going to get quite complicated and be hard to pose. So I'm going to show you a different method, especially when you have clothing, which is really good for posing. So for this, what we're going to do is use Transpose Master in combination with something called ZSpheres or ZSpheres. For that, I'm just going to clear the masks on this by drawing a square in the canvas to clear it. Under Z plugins, if you click this little dot, it's going to dock it to the side. And then what we're looking for is something called Transpose Master. And under Transpose Master, we want to tick a ZSphere rig. So with Transpose Master, what it allows us to do is work on a lower resolution version, or the lowest subdivisions we have here. If you don't have a set of subdivisions, maybe you've got something that's like in the millions, I wouldn't suggest doing this because it's going to basically tank and blow up your computer. Reserved for ones that have lower subdivisions, something that's a bit more easy to manage when it comes to T-posing. So click the T-pose button. Now what's happened here, it's gone through a process. It's made a new Z tool in the top right over here. It's made our character transparent. It's made them all low resolution. And it's also added this weird sphere. It's called a Z-sphere. So with the Z-sphere, we're going to make use of draw, move, scale, and rotate. I'm going to make sure symmetry's on. That's going to be the center point. I start at the pelvis and just move it into the center point there. In draw mode, we can tap on the sphere, then that's going to create a new circle or sphere. And then move, we can just click and drag and bring this in. It's the same sort of consideration that you're aiming for the joints or close to the anatomy. Usually how I like to draw this is complete the extremities first. So if I come and draw on the second point, I drag this all the way down to the ankle or around to the foot. Remember, we're working on the sine plane as well, so make sure it's selected in 3D space. Nice thing about Z-spheres, we don't have to complete everything. So I'm not going to do the knees, I'm not going to do the feet, the toes. This is just so it's not going to interact with the rest of the body. So you can do a very simple rig, and then we can make it more advanced for the piece that we do want to move. So maybe you've got a specific screenshot where you don't want to move the legs too much, but the arms are going to be very advanced. This is a really good way of doing it. Let's bring another sphere about up to the neck, or where the spine would be. It doesn't actually matter if this is anatomically correct. It doesn't have to follow the curvature of the spine. This is just so we have good pivot points for moving, and basically Z-sphere is going to do the rest. It's going to start to do the skinning and the rigging for us. Next, I draw out some shoulders and basically move that to the apex of the shoulder. Make sure that's positioned nicely from the top as well, because that's going to be very important. So with the draw button, I'll draw another one, come to move, and then I'll just take this all the way down to the end. And this is a very quick way of doing it, because if you come to draw mode, you can basically tap in the center, and that's going to add another pivot point. So that's going to be useful for the elbow, and then you can just reposition that without having to adjust it too much. So that's a very basic rig, and it's going to move things around. I suspect there might be some errors around the t-shirt here, or the jacket. It might bring it up with it. There could be some errors around the head. I highly doubt it, but we'll see. If they do happen, I'm going to show you how to fix them. So just as a recap, we have our original high poly mesh somewhere here, and what we're currently working on is a copy of that in Z-sphere mode, and then we're going to transfer it back later. Before we do that, we need to just test that this rig is working the way we want it to. So to do that, and how ZBrush is, it's obviously not going to be over here, it's going to be hidden somewhere else, right? But if you come down to rigging in the tool section, there's going to be a button called bind mesh, and what it's going to do is going to bind this geometry to this Z-sphere rig system that we use, almost sticking it to it so we can test how it starts to deform. So with bind mesh activated, really remember that you're in bind mesh, because that's going to be important. We can then come to move, scale, and rotate. Rotate's a quite good one, and what I can do is basically rotate these arms upwards. Now, a couple of things are happening here, which is interesting. So the first is it's very laggy, and that's because this low definition mesh isn't that low. It's actually in the kind of millions. So my computer's trying very hard to move things along. Second thing is that the head is squishing, so we can fix that. And also part of the jacket has been drawn up. So those are all the predictions that we've made. Hopefully with your characters, they're low resolution, so you can see how the skin is deforming. It'll be much more live. If it is too high resolution, it's a bit of a slideshow, but you can see what's going on. So it's possible to pose like that. So Control Z or Control Z to undo that. Now, really important, you want to come out of bind mesh. So treat bind mesh as your testing mode almost. So back in Z-sphere mode, I'm going to come to draw, and what I'm going to do is just make the inclusion of a head. So if I go to the center that snaps to green, I can draw out a head sphere. Doesn't have to be anything advanced. I can just make a big orb up here, and the scale and the position basically defines how much of that surface is going to be attached to that bone. So a very small one's not going to collect much data from outside, but a big one is. So it's really funny. I see a couple of tutorials and where people do it, they make them really thin and skinny, but the size does actually make an impact on the overall mesh. So you do want to scale it up roughly to the volume of the character. Because we've scaled it up there, it just means that that's definitely not moving. Basically everything around the head isn't going to move when the arms move. So we can take advantage of that. If you come to draw, what we're going to do is make these almost like little rib cages that are going to contain the coat information. That's going to create a mid joint, and then from that mid joint we can add some more spheres. And what I'm going to do is just move the spheres up roughly to where the coat is, just underneath the armpit. And what it's saying is all this mesh is going to be magnetized, so hopefully that when we move this, it's not going to drag all that up. Try its best. It's never exactly perfect, but it's better to what we had with the original. I'm just going to add a second one at the bottom in the hopes that that will also just maintain the coat, you know. And this isn't a perfect rig system. Obviously, if we wanted this perfect, an animator would have to spend their time weight painting it, but it's a very powerful solution. So if you go down to bind mesh, that's how we preview the work that we've done, just to make sure that it's okay. So with bind mesh, you might see it's happening now. I have little control of sort of what's going over, but as you can see with the coat, it's maintaining more of that structure. Now, if you wanted to take this part of the coat, what you could do is create another one of these little ribs, nodes off to the side, and that will also separate it. I would just sculpt this and repair it. It's quite an easy one. You can just get the move tool and start to readjust it upwards. But if you wanted to be very precise about it, you could just create another one of these ribs, and then it's going to magnetize this part of the mesh over to there. There's slight hood deformation, so also we might want to make another rib that comes out and just protects that area. So once that's done, you can do things like bend the elbows and do all the repositioning that you want. Maybe they're weighted to one side, like standing on one foot. And once you're happy with the repositioning, what we're going to do is come back to the transpose master, and then we're going to hit the button T pose. And what it's going to do is going to transfer all this information and copy it back over to our main mesh. So as you can see now, it's going through a process, selecting each one of the objects and then transferring that skin data over. So it's important to know that this is sort of like a one-way valve operation. Once you've done the rig, you're going to have to re-rig it or repose it. So I suggest saving off that version just in case you want to come back to it later. You might find that there's something you don't like or you want to readjust it. So it's nice to have that. So it's a real cool method of reposing a character. This is sort of like the worst case scenario. You've got quite an advanced piece of garment and you're trying to post manipulate it. You'd kind of basically use a mixture of the two processes. So maybe the coat, I would prefer to use the masking just so I have some more control. I can do things like protect the zip and bring it around. And then with the main body, because it's more like a bone structure, I can just use the T pose. So you use a mix and match of both of them. Or if you're working in the games industry, chances are you won't be doing that. You'd be handing off to an animator, or they would have rigged it by the time you'd textured it or done the high poly. But if you're doing a portfolio piece, maybe for like Unreal Engine or Marmoset, I highly suggest not posing the high poly. So just make sure that you do the low poly, make sure the animation loops are all okay, and then transfer that, rig that low poly mesh, and then take pictures of it. That's far more impressive than basically like posing a high poly, topologizing something that already has been pre-modeled or pre-high polyed. Okay, so there you go. You now know how to move parts of your limb while you're sculpting instead of using something like the move brush. We also went through how to repair something if you've accidentally Dynameshed it together. That often happens, so we understand how to do that with live Boolean meshes. The power of using that in combination with multi-sub tool select, so you can pre-mask things, select other things in that pizza box stack, and then move them all together under the same pivot point, which is very useful. But if you're looking for something that's a little bit more advanced with more structure, you also have the options for ZSphere rigs, and you also know how to basically solve solutions where it's starting to deform and stretch other pieces around. Hopefully you got loads of value out of that video. It's something I see a lot of students struggle with. I ask that you leave a like just so you have a reference back to this video. Maybe someone else wants to understand how to move limbs. If you've liked it, you can come back to it later. Also subscribe, because I'm going to be releasing far more content on making characters, more specifically for the games industry. Remember that there is an entire library of videos here that you might have missed. Some good ones like lighting or retopologizing, sculpting the head. We also have a vibrant Discord community. I'll leave the link in the bottom. People are introducing themselves, getting feedback for their artwork, and just showing works in progress. I'm often looking over these and seeing what sort of talent there is. Also in the link is the 3D Mutiny website. So if you go there, you can receive a free welcome package. I'll also be releasing a lot of content on there that I wouldn't usually do on YouTube. To be honest, that's all to come. It's going to be structured around basically like free educational content on comparison with university courses. So really a space you want to be subscribed to and signed up to. So thanks for watching the video, and I'll catch you on the next one.